Hello again, everybody. This is Rusty, aka William, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. And this is our podcast, The Blues Doctor Recommends, and we're glad you're here. Now, the Blues Doctor and his staff have been on sabbatical for the summer, but we will be back soon, so we hope you stay with us. Right now, however, I felt compelled to talk a little bit about the recent congressional hearing with Dr. Tony Fauci, which occurred this week. I think everybody pretty much in the US now knows who Dr. Fauci is and what his role in the COVID pandemic was. So I'm not going to repeat much of that. I do want to clear up some misconceptions that I've heard recently in the media, however. First, he served as director of the NIAID, our National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. He was not the director of the entire NIH, as I've heard more than one pundit say on the air. The NIAID is one of the six major branches of the NIH, and the director of the NIAID reports to the director of the NIH. I'm very familiar with the structure and function of the NIH in my role as an investigator in cancer over the last 3 decades, so I understand the relationship that the officers in those branches have pretty well. So while Dr. Fauci was the director of a large organization with a large budget, he was not a despot or tyrant, as I've heard some people suggest. He was a federal employee, just like thousands of other people. The big thing that launched this recent investigation is that a diary from Dr. Fauci was found recently and turned over to the press. This diary apparently was written on a government computer, which was open to the public, basically. And that diary contained multiple entries that seemed to be at odds with what he said or did publicly. Also, I want to clarify my relationship with him. I met Dr. Fauci back in the mid 1990s when I was a young investigator with an interest in HIV/AIDS and cancer in women. I was invited to Bethesda to present some of my data to the NIH on cervical cancer and HIV infected women at a meeting of NIH scientists and collaborators. Afterwards, Dr. Fauci congratulated me on my work and talked to me for several minutes and encouraged me to continue and said he hoped to work with me again in the future. We spoke on several conference calls after that, along with many other investigators, and I always respected him. Full disclosure, I was funded by the NIAID and Dr. Fauci for what was called an AIDS malignancy consortium. In about 1999, we received about $250,000 or so, and I'll put the reference on the screen for anybody who wants it. With that established, let's go on to the hearing. Most of you probably saw that Senator Rand Paul chaired the Senate committee that subpoenaed Dr. Fauci and directed the inquiry. He and the other committee members asked Dr. Fauci a series of questions over the course of about 3 hours or so. And after a brief opening statement, Dr. Fauci basically refused to answer any of the questions and took the fifth, as they say in the mobster movies, over and over again. I think somebody counted up that he, quote, took the fifth 111 times. From what we've been told since then from the committee staff, there were four main areas that the committee wanted to ask Dr. Fauci about. First was the origin of the COVID virus. Did it come from a lab in Wuhan, China, and accidentally or intentionally, perhaps, escape? Or did it originate from an animal virus that crossed over to humans somehow, either through the wet market in the city of Wuhan or from wild bats or from somewhere else? And beyond that, the committee wanted to know why Dr. Fauci's public statements about the origin was different from what he wrote in private in his diary. For example, Dr. Fauci was generally very firm in public about saying that the virus was not created in the Wuhan lab. However, in his diary, he said that he had convened a meeting of experts in his office to discuss that question. And the consensus by a vote of 10-2 was in favor of a lab origin. He apparently disagreed with that and tried to convince some of the members of that group to change their vote. And finally, he just ignored them and announced that it was not a lab creation. He later wrote in his diary that he had come to believe that the virus came from the lab, but he never stated that in public. The committee wanted to ask him why he made those decisions. Second, the committee wanted to know if, in his role with the NIAID, he had used federal money to fund gain of function research at the Wuhan lab. While the entire story is not known now, it does appear that federal money did go indirectly to the Wuhan lab by way of an intermediary. The point of this line of questioning was that the federal government outlawed gain of function research in U.S. laboratories using federal dollars. However, it is allowed in overseas laboratories under exceptional and very specified circumstances. The committee wanted Dr. Fauci to explain how and why federal dollars under his control made it to Wuhan and did go towards gain of function research. Third, the committee wanted to question Dr. Fauci about his role in creating the policies for social distancing, masking, and particularly for school closures and business closures. In public, he supported all of those things, but again, his diary suggested something different. He acknowledged in his diary that there was no known benefit to masking or social distancing, and that there was no evidence that the virus was contagious or life-threatening among children. The committee wanted to clarify his position and ask why his public statements were so different from what he wrote in his diary. Fourth, the committee wanted to discuss Dr. Fauci's apparent infatuation with celebrities and the media and his own sense of self-importance. Again, from his diary, he documents multiple phone calls, dinners, and other personal interactions with people like Julia Roberts or Barbara Streisand and various others. He was clearly starstruck by that. He notes that both of them lauded him for his public service and told him what a hero he was and basically heaped praise on him. He also mentions talking with media figures like Jake Tapper, who likewise told him how important he was and how courageous he was. Dr. Fauci mentioned in his diary at one point that he arranged to meet Jake Tapper for dinner, despite the fact that that very day he had endorsed social distancing and not meeting with others in public places. Some of the media members even told Dr. Fauci what questions they were going to ask him before they interviewed him, presumably to allow him to be prepared for those questions. Finally, the committee wanted to address Dr. Fauci's attitude, for lack of a better word. He came across as arrogant, actually, in the diaries. I think that's the only word I can use for that. He seemed at times to suggest that he just couldn't be bothered to speak with anyone he considered beneath him intellectually. The committee wanted to ask him how that attitude could have affected his job and his performance. So those are the basic facts. I initially wanted to give Dr. Fauci the benefit of the doubt. He is a very accomplished man and a nice guy, or at least to me and many others who have met him. I felt like he got caught in a situation he wasn't prepared for and basically did the best he could under the circumstances. Since the release of the diaries and the congressional hearing, I've really given a lot more thought to this and have now come to somewhat different conclusions. First, it's now 90% plus certain among the scientific community that the virus was, in fact, manufactured in a lab, and the most likely candidate by far was Wuhan. I believe Dr. Fauci knew that all along and tried to downplay that because he realized it wouldn't look good from a number of standpoints. I think he hoped that his personal prestige would be enough to discourage any disagreement with that point, and he was eventually proven wrong. Two, it's all but certain now that federal dollars did go to Wuhan for the purpose of gain-of-function research, albeit through an intermediary, and that Dr. Fauci was not fully aware of that, at least initially. Now, historically, it has not been uncommon for a lab that gets funding from the NIAID or any other NIH division to subcontract with other labs for special services, even overseas labs, even Chinese labs for that matter. Say there is a particular lab that is well known for doing a highly specialized process very well. You might ask the investigator in that lab to collaborate on your project and agree to pay him for the work that they did in that collaboration. Now, I admit it could be argued that that's not a good idea and that federal money should never leave the country for this purpose. But it was not illegal or even unusual for that to happen at that time. What Dr. Fauci did wrong was to try to cover it up. I believe he realized that it would be very difficult to explain that kind of arrangement to the American public, so he chose not to do so, hoping, again, that his prestige would discourage any more questions about it. 3, as far as masking and social distancing go, Dr. Fauci knew there was no real data, but he chose to recommend something rather than nothing. I can understand that, but he should have been much more upfront about the lack of data and admitted at the time that we didn't and don't know for sure what would have helped in that circumstance. And he could have handled the closure of schools and businesses that way as well. He could have acknowledged at first we really didn't know whether closing businesses or schools would really make any difference or that there would be any benefit. But then, as the social and economic costs started to become clear, he could have made a statement to the effect that there was no clear overall benefit to those closures and that those decisions would probably be better made at the local or maybe even personal level rather than at the federal level. Fourth, what can you say about Dr. Fauci's attitude? It may not be illegal to think you are smarter and better than everyone else, but it seems undignified somehow and disappointing, at least to me. In some sense, all of us probably would have been starstruck to some extent in those circumstances with celebrities fawning over you. But it seems to me that he lost control of his ego and he forgot that he was a servant of the public and not a master of the public. So the last questions I asked myself were these. Did Dr. Fauci make mistakes in his official statements? I believe he did, but I also don't believe there was any intent to do harm. He was a pure academic physician with 50 years of service, and he was 80 years old. What would he gain by intentionally subverting the system he'd served for so long? The other question is, did Dr. Fauci let his ego cloud his judgment? Yeah, it's pretty clear that it did. But I wondered, could that have happened to me in that situation? I'd like to hope not, but no one has walked in his shoes, so I can't say for sure. Finally, do Dr. Fauci's actions rise to the level of criminality? I don't believe they do, but that's not for me to decide. The American legal system, I believe, is still the best in the world, so I'm willing to let it run its course. My personal sense is one of disappointment. I still believe Dr. Fauci is a good man and a brilliant scientist who got caught in a terribly difficult situation and made some bad decisions. And that's all we have today from the Blues Doctor, from our Orange Beach office. We'll be back again later this summer. Hope everybody has a great summer, and we'll see you soon.